Great. Good day, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today for the book talk featuring John Hamerlinck and his recently released book. My name is Hunter Goodman. I am a ABCDI Institute steward, and I'm also work with the University of Arkansas as a faculty member. It is an honor to present this because I have long known John Hamerlinck as a part of the community engagement community nationally. So I'm, as well as the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, it process and everything that we do here at ABCDI. So this is quite an honor to work with John and with the network on this book release. So as far as a little bit of information, the book information is The Locking Arms, Changing Communities, Leading Grassroots Change. And it expands on short essays on John's popular website, Leading Differently, Useful Explorations for People Who Want to Change the World. The book looks at concepts of leadership outside of the usual positional and organizational model and discusses how anyone can lead efforts to improve the quality of life in their own community. It's strongly influenced by asset-based community development. And just to give you a little bit of information about John, which is in the book, there is a bio in his book if you already have a copy of it and have been going through it in great detail like I have. John has spoken and written extensively on topics related to civic engagement. He has facilitated trainings in asset-based community development throughout the country. John brings experience in philanthropic government and higher education sectors. And John spent 10 years at Minnesota Campus Compact, which I think is how we originally met, John, where among other duties, he directed the Center for Digital Civic Engagement and the Civic Leadership Initiative Online. John has a BA in American Studies and an MS in social responsibility from St. Cloud State University. And so the way we're going to flow this today, because you came to hear John and you came to hear reflections on his book, is we're actually going to give a minute for John to bring up his slides, and I'll give just a few very brief reflections. Then John will have some slides and information that he will give you on the book and his insights on the book. And then we will make this very conversational. So if you have your camera off, please join us, turn your camera on. We would love to see your face. If you're in a situation where you can't turn your camera on, we certainly understand. But we want this to be a very conversational hour ahead. And there's so much here that we can talk about. And so just a few highlights for those who may not have read the book yet. We really start with traditional notions of leadership and the distinctions around types of leadership, then into asset-based community development, strategy and organizing, human relations, communication challenges, barriers, evaluating your own progress, and quick takeaways and additional points. And the thing I love about this book, so John, get ready. I'm getting ready to pass the baton to you. The thing that I love about this book is that I am a PhD in leadership. I've read a lot of leadership books over my time in higher education. And this one is very easy to read. You do not have to have a degree to read this book and to utilize it. It is practical, it is applied, and it's grounded in those core aspects of leadership and of course of asset-based community development. And so it's really, John, I appreciate you writing a book at the heart, whether it be someone who is a youth or someone who is in the middle of life or a senior citizen, being able to pull this up and know that they have a role to play in changing their communities. And so with that, John, I will turn it over to you, and I will be your facilitator to make sure that as we go along, we do want to make sure this is conversational. I'll come back online and help us with questions. And Jen Kuba is monitoring the chat. So as we go through, please feel free to make any comments in the chat. So John, let me pass it over to you to walk us through the high points of your book.
Okay,
Congratulations.
thanks. Thanks,
Yes,
Hunter. Can you see my slides?
we can.
Okay, let me move this. So, in 2017, I started this website, Leading Differently. And the reason I did it was because I had been running leadership development programs or retreats for college students. And as I was looking at the literature on this, it was all the literature was kind of focused on leadership development as positional and something like you need an org chart to understand. And so I set out to look for the kind of information that when I would do leadership training, I would frequently, so I've done like ABCD training for boards of directors and professionals, but a lot of the leadership training I've done has been for students, very um, young people who are very idealistic and wanted to change things. And so I set out to do that. And as I started writing all these essays, there's dozens and dozens of them on the website. Um, I started to look at the analytics and see which ones people were reading the most and which ones they were sharing the most. And it was interesting. The most popular post over the last 9 years is one titled Community Outreach versus Community Engagement. One that tries to understand the difference between those two concepts. The second most popular one is on one-to-one relational meetings. And as I went and looked at the most popular ones, they were all things that resonated with ABCD, with doing work in a way that spoke to the core of ABCD. They were asset-based, internally focused, and relationship-driven, right? So these are the cores of ABCD. So I decided to last year, so I've been retired for a year, um, and I decided what I wanted to do is make it more accessible than having to go through a website and put the things in order and add things to which I've been thinking about a little longer. And so I wrote this book and came out in May. And so there it is. There's my website. The first thing that I thought I need to do was if you're looking to do a project to do change, um, you have to believe that transformative change is possible. Um, Over the years, I've facilitated numerous training sessions, and uh, I always try to start them with something that reinforces the notion that, yeah, it's not just it would be great if this could happen, but you can actually make something happen. I know this because I'm 68 years old, and in my life, I've seen it. So I do a lot of trainings for college students. And when I was the age of most college students, Nelson Mandela was more than a decade into a prison sentence that lasted 26 years. And if you were to tell 19-year-old me that someday a black man would be president of South Africa, I would have thought you were not very well informed and maybe a little naive. And if you were to tell me that that man would be Nelson Mandela, I would have thought you had gone completely insane. However, you would have, however, been correct. Mandela walked out of prison in 1990 and was elected president in 1994. So during my lifetime, I've seen not only that, but I've seen civil rights activists from the 60s fought to end Jim Crow. Smallpox was declared eradicated in 1980. The Berlin Wall fell. Transformative change is possible, and we have all seen it in our lives. So another thing that is important to understand is that you have to have a shared vision. There has to be a shared vision among the allies, the people who are desiring change. This is an illustration created by the Minnesota design team about 20, 30 years ago. And if you look at all the people in the no vision box, all want kind of the same outcomes. They want generally the same things to happen in the world, but they really don't have a vision for what this looks like afterwards. And if you impose a vision on them, then you're taking this kind of old-fashioned leadership notion, well, the leaders will take us there. And so the people who really want it are still kind of floundering in the middle. And so you might have fewer people. So if you look at those three boxes, the one with the shared vision has fewer people, but they all have a clearer vision of their goals. So your vision has to be reflective of shared values. You have to be able to explain it in the least complex way possible. It has to be realistically achievable, and it should motivate people to act. So I'm going to try to go through some stuff really quickly here. So I want to talk about ABCD, right? Because this is about ABCD. And we have no idea what this image has to do with ABC, but I'll let you know. So if we were mapping the assets of these two animals and their deficits and then comparing them, the coyote, fast, Badger, not very fast, short, stumpy little legs, but kind of vicious, big claws, can dig in the ground. The uh, the collaboration between unlikely allies. These you would think, these two, they both look kind of mean. They're not going to work together. But when you look at their assets and their deficits, so the coyote's fast, but he can't dig in ground. Their shared value is they both like to eat little rodents, right? And so what we see in nature is this. The coyote can follow a rodent down into a hole, stands there over that hole. The badger gets down there and digs in a hole, and then they both have something to eat. So uh, the collaboration between naturals, not only between these two unlikely bedfellows, is important to remember, because effective leaders find ways, opportunities for those with shared values to achieve a goal, even if those actors are frequently invisible or on the margins of a community. So how I first got into ABCD was I was the only paid staff person on a fairly large, comprehensive community initiative funded by a foundation that had this enormous board of about 15, 20 people. And the foundation that was sponsoring it brought all the grantees together in one place. And one of the speakers was Geraldine Sheehan, who, if you've been with the ABCD Institute a long time, you know Geraldine, probably the smartest person I've ever met, just a fantastic person. And I was talking to her about the work I was doing, and she goes, there's a name for that. And she told me about ABCD. And subsequently, so after that, I had a job with a foundation, and Geraldine was in between stints where she was out of the country. She's done a lot of work in Central and South America, and she was living in Northfield, and I was talking to her one day, and she goes, "Hey, you wanna meet Jody Kretzmann?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, of course." And so she invited me and maybe like 5 or 6 other people to her house just to meet Jody. And people were just introducing themselves. And by the time all these people who were working in this manner were done introducing themselves, I said, I'm never doing any other kind of work other than this. And so I have her to thank for not only meeting Jody, but then also was introduced to John McKnight, and have over the years had many conversations and correspondence with John. And so a lot of this work comes out of John McKnight's work. And here's one of the most important things that I learned from John, and that is to focus on associations. If you've gone to or seen people do trainings, you've seen this one many times. John used it a long time ago, and I think it's still important to reinforce. People need to understand the difference between institutions, which we normally rely on to solve our problems, and associations, which are this great under-leveraged resource for strengthening communities. They're unpaid, often informal. They don't even have names often, but they're groups of people who share a common interest. So how do they operate? Associations operate under consensus, right? If you're the quilting club, you decide, well, what are we going to do? Let's make some quilts and bring them to the county fair. They all agree that's what they're going to do. Institutions operate under control, and you want institutions to operate under control. You don't want to be laying on an operating table and have your surgeon ask her crew, where does everybody think I should cut? Can we come to a consensus on where I should cut? You don't want to. You want institutions to operate under control. So what do? Associations care. You have people who care, who are passionate about something, to come to a consensus to do something and get that work done. Institutions do production of goods or services. So if you're a college or university, you're producing baccalaureate degrees or whatever. If you're a business, if you're a manufacturing business, you're doing production under control to assume to get done what you need to get done. Who do they serve? So if you're in an association, you serve residents, right? So it's just folks. It's folks who care about stuff, come to a consensus to do something, and get that thing done. Institutions need consumers. They need consumers of goods or services delivered under controls to achieve what it is that they're trying to achieve. And finally, who do they need? Or what do they need? Associations need capacities. They need the assets of residents who care about something to come to consensus to do something and get that done. And institutions need needs. So I'm not saying here that, oh, associations are great, institutions are bad. I'm saying what you need to do is understand the proper place for people within a project that you might be doing, and then where you might benefit from adding more associations to that mix. So we currently live in a time when a lot of people in America, I don't know if everybody on this meeting is in the US, but here in America, there's a lot of folks who think democracy is being attacked, right? So the country is changing, or at least the perception is that there's a threat to democracy. Democracy is voting, but everything else that democracy is, everything else is associations. Associations is where citizenship, where civic life resides. I remember John McKnight telling a story about when the Soviet Union collapsed. Some foundation invited John and Jody to, I think a meeting was in, I don't know, one Poland or some country, and that a group of folks from all these countries that used to be dominated by the Soviet Union. And John and Jody were there to give them a sense of what developing a civil society looks like. If you've been under the thumb of some big monster for all these years. And so they started asking questions during their presentation about what are the types of things that you do with other people to make life more bearable where you live. In what ways are you working with other folks who live where you live to make things happen? And people just were not resonating with that concept. So John says, so let's take a break. We'll figure out a new way to frame that question. And a guy came up to John and said, "Oh, you're talking about a conspiracy." So in a place where people are not used to having that kind of world where you can go to your friends and neighbors and make changes that you want to make, it's considered a conspiracy, which I kind of like the idea of conspiring to do good things. So one of these images down the lower right is from an Adopt a Highway program. And there's an Adopt a Highway program, I think, in every state in the United States. And this is an evidence of, it's a perfect example of associations mobilized to do something that we may think is only within the sphere of institutions. So nobody that I've seen can pinpoint exactly when the first one is. There's people from Wisconsin who say it's Wisconsin. There's people from Texas who say it was started in Texas because Texas claims everything's. But some brilliant civil servant is looking at the budget and said, we need to cut things in the budget. We're going to have to cut picking up garbage in the highways. And some brilliant person said, what if we just asked folks if they would pick up garbage, and then we'll put up a sign saying these people did that. And so what you have is evidence that you can do this, because all these people whose names are on signs are clubs and organizations who they don't have a mission statement around environmental stewardship, but they're willing to pick up garbage, right? Because they're with other folks who care about the same things they care about, and they're just doing this. So what are other versions of problems that we need to look at that we could model on an Adopt a Highway program? How could you mobilize folks who are just in your community? And again, a lot of these times associations are hidden. And when you start to talk to people in the community, somebody will go, there's a group of folks who do Tai Chi in the park every morning at this time. And so that's an association, right? This is a group of people who like the same things being with each other. This is a way you can mobilize them to do something else that you're trying to get done in your community. But there's also if you're familiar with the concept of a cave, these are people who get together on a regular basis. CAVE, CAV, it stands for Citizens Against Virtually Everything. So there are some informal associations that are people who they sit at the same table and have coffee every morning just because they're friends. And then other people get together and have coffee and complain about what the city is doing or what the state is doing or what the government is doing. So there's all sorts of associations. So here's 4 strategies that you can use to increase working with associations. One is increase the number of personal relationships within the community. If you and people you are working with go and talk and meet 3 people who you've never met before and just have more personal relationships with people you don't know. Secondly, be deliberate about mapping associational assets. Yeah, you can identify, these are all the clubs and these are all the ones that people sort of know about, but be deliberate about seeking out, asking people, do you know of any groups that are doing interesting things? And people will come up with information that you can't find anywhere else. Thirdly, allow institutions and associations to do the things that they do best. During the first Bush administration, of the first Bush's first administration, there was something called the Points of Light project or something, where they decided to award federal grants to faith-based institutions. And what they found out after the first round of grants was that faith-based institutions didn't know much about federal grant compliance, because you had to know, what sort of nonprofit organizations know. And so it'd be better if somebody else was a fiscal agent for the money and allowing them to do what they did. So if it's a church group and they don't have a database, maybe they have a recipe box with index cards and people's names in it, and they have a phone tree or whatever. They do what they do because they're not an institution. And so figure out the ways that we can leverage institutions when we need something done that institutions do, and things that don't need that approach to work. Figure out what is it that we're trying to get done that informal, formal associations could do. And lastly, provide opportunities for residents' voices to be heard. I'm not talking about having a public hearing about something that's already a done deal at a city council meeting, but just find ways for people who have never been asked their opinion to give their opinion about something. This is a concept that is, so ABCD is rooted in this belief that the capacities of community residents leveraged with their collective relationships can be organized to improve the quality of life in a community, right? So capacity, same thing as assets. And ABCD is all about that. Most people get the relationships part. They enjoy interacting with like-minded people, and the idea of finding, people's gifts, skills, and talents. People love doing that. Part of the reasons a lot of people really latched on to ABCD is because it was fun to do asset mapping, and it actually, people like to talk about the things they care about. Capacity, however, is sometimes problematic because people get stuck thinking that there is some mysterious, quote, critical mass that is necessary in order to achieve a goal. Sure, if you're looking for something that will eventually need to be voted on, you need 50% plus 1 votes, and so you need that kind of capacity. But for many very valuable smaller projects, there is no magic number. Achieving a larger goal happens often as the result of many tiny successes. If you're at 0 and your goal is 10, You don't necessarily need a plan to go from 0 to 10 in one step. There might be any combination of numbers that add up into 10. So capacity has no magic number. Sometimes the assets of 2 people is enough capacity. Other times you need 6, 41, 13, whatever. I think too often we get stuck on this idea that we got to get this huge tent and everybody has to get on board, and then stuff just doesn't get done. And so I think that understanding that just because you don't have a large number of people doesn't mean you can't do something good. Capacity also refers to the ability to understand something. The idea that community capacity suggests there are multiple strategies to create community change because different members of the community see issues from different perspectives. This is where ABCD is useful, right? It reminds us to talk to the people in the margins. If your issue is homelessness, you need to talk to homeless people. If you have an issue related to school, you should probably talk to some students. So don't get caught up in the numbers because you will find the capacity you require in the capacities you discover. You'll find the capacity you require in the capacities you discovered. So I'm going to recommend you try a scaled down asset mapping project. And I've talked to many people over the years who said, hey, we're doing this big community-wide project. We got a large database. We're trying to interview, 75% of the people in the community have been interviewed so far, and they think they're creating a database that when they need it, they can go to there and then pull the data out. And, as much as I admire the passion and ambition of folks who want to go big right away, I think I would like to invite people to try a different strategy, and that is to scale down. Because if you're waiting for some enormous capacity inventory to be completed, some of those assets won't be there by the time you think you need them, right? Because assets atrophy if you don't use them. Relationships, one person moves out of town, you not only lose those assets, but use the relational assets that person had. And so you need to look at what do we have right now with a large enough group of people who can get something done and not wait for an enormous project to begin. So I think that the proof of concept, people will see things happen. We tried to work this way and we did something smaller, and that will seed future success. Like I mentioned earlier, the most popular post on my website is one that talks about this, and you can read these. I'm not going to read through them, but and you probably know intuitively that these are two different things. But community engagement, and there's a role for both. I'm going to suggest that there is a role for some community outreach, but community engagement should happen early and often. So these things that are happening when you get people in at the start of your attempts to get something done, that's critically important from the beginning. Community engagement should happen early and often. The goal is to organize into support of achieving your change. So if you want to mobilize folks, they're going to be compelled and incentivized to act. If they were there, if they just weren't asked their opinion after the fact, but if they were there when you were talking about what you might want to do. So outreach defines the community and audience it's intended to reach, but engagement can create self-defined communities or affinity groups. So if you're engaged with the community, you will discover like subgroups of people who may already be thinking about or working on this. You're not just sending out a survey to community members asking them their opinion about something. So engagement is formative, right? It's so community outreach is like something where like the table says it's transactional. So you're trying to find out some information, but if you're actually engaged and connected, it's going to inform what you're doing to move forward in a different way because it thrives on diversity and inclusion. So the more diverse ideas you can get will come from engaging with people instead of just asking them for something. So I know a number of people are actually interested in how do you evaluate what you're doing and is working. Um, ooh, okay. I think I can get through this quickly enough. Um, so I would say if you're doing an asset-based community development project, the most important kind of strategy you might want to look at is the community capitals framework developed by the late Cornelia Butler Flora and her husband, Jan. Um, Basically, it says that there are 7 community capitals: natural, cultural, human capital, social capital, political capital, financial capital, built capital. If you think about that and you think about what kinds of assets you're trying to identify, it's quite similar to asset-based community development. And what it also does when you look at that framework, which I'm not going to go into details, we don't have time, you can use whole hours and hours on discovering how you use it, but there's a lot of information out there, people who've written about it. It reminds you that in traditional evaluation, we're always looking for attribution, right? So we're going to talk about logic models next. And like logic models, you have something, you did this, usually people call it an intervention, and then something else came out on the other side that was made it better. So they're trying to attribute that. So instead of attribution, what you can look for when you're doing ABCD evaluation is contribution. So how did a contribution to um, natural capital or social capital influence your goals around financial capital? So you can think, instead of thinking things on a linear line, your evaluation, you got to think about all these capitals that get like on different planes, right? So it's like think like how a screw is threaded. Like there might be something that's on the other side of the screw on a lower level. So things are happening all the time related to all these different capitals, and they influence each other. Um, I'll let you, read on your own more about that because I'm just not going to have time to go into anymore. The other thing is this SOL um, stands for standard of living, and QOL is quality of life. And people confuse these two concepts a lot. There's a difference between standard of living, quality of life. Standard of living is essentially a measure of consumption. And quality of it's just so it's wealth and class disparity, consumption, and economic stability. But quality of life includes things like well-being and health, family life, identity and engagement, and a sense of place. So, and it's just as important. It's important to have, believe me, so many problems are rooted in poverty. It is important to have some standard of living considerations and to build wealth in people who have no wealth. But quality of life considerations are also, and sometimes even more important. I live in Minnesota. 3/4 of the population of Minnesota lives within the 7-county area of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So that's 3/4 of the population living in 25% of the geography. And if you put all of the people in Minnesota in that same tiny little geography, you'd still have a population density less than Boston or New York. But why would you want to, right? So there are people who choose to live in rural places. There are people who, it's you can make more money doing the same job if you move to Minneapolis and did that job than you can out in some, county out in west central Minnesota. But people have other reasons for living in those places. And so there's just a little brief thing, but there's another, again, if you would Cornelia Flora is brilliant. There's other articles written by Cornelia Flora that are related to that concept too, and I would really encourage people to look at those. Logic models. If you write federal grants, you have to always include a logic model, and it's a good practice. It's interesting. Evaluation hinges on assumptions, and assumptions underlie everything we do. A logic model is a graphic depiction of your theory of change, right? It's linear, and you often see it expressed like number one is the situation. Then there's inputs and outcomes. For example, if the situation is a headache, an input might be obtaining aspirin, and output would be taking the aspirin, and the outcome would be feeling better. Logic model can put everybody on the same page in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. However, there are limitations of logic models. These include things like they represent reality, but they are not reality. Human relationships are not formulas. If you're doing work in community, you're doing work with people. And so things that are making assumptions that are easily fit into little boxes and go in a straight line doesn't always work that way. And projects are not linear. It's like you may assume things are going to go that way, but if you've done any work in communities at all, there's a lot of curves and detours into getting things. Rarely happen on a straight line the way you hope they would happen. Logic models also focus on expected outcomes, not actual outcomes. And these can be either positive or negative. There's sometimes unintended consequences that can be positive unintended consequences. So you need to make room for, again, formative evaluation within logic models, so you can not wait till the end and say, oh, this did work or it didn't work. So you can change, midstream. There's also logic models have a tendency to assess what is easiest to measure rather than what is most valuable. And a lot of people have been guilty of that, just that we wanted to have a good report. So we measured the easy thing to report, right? So Randy Stoker used to teach at University of Wisconsin. Told me this story about that project where there was a school somewhere, I can't remember, New York or someplace, where they were celebrating 10 years of a project where college students tutored students at a local elementary school or junior high. It was a 10-year celebration of this. They had thousands of students put in tens of thousands of hours. And then when they looked over time, whether math scores improved, they hadn't improved appreciably over that 10 years. So it kind of, their tutoring wasn't making a big dent in the project. But what they were counting, what they were celebrating was this process. And so you value what you measure, and you measure what you value. And if what you value is the PR you can get about saying we did all this great volunteer work in community, then that's one thing. But if what you really value is improving the math score of young people, then you didn't do so good.
John,
Yeah.
just a time check real quick. It's about 1:40.
Okay. I'm gonna skip the indicators. You can read. A lot of people, if you've done any evaluation, you know about indicators. But I want to talk just briefly about participant evaluation. We are all walking around this world with cameras in our movie cameras, still cameras, audio recorders in our pockets. That is documentary evidence of change. And people have been doing this for years. And if you look at this image, it's like this is evidence that whatever this woman has been doing in her goal of weight loss is working. Right. And so try to imagine how can you use people who are in the middle? So if you're working with, again, young people, can you send a junior high school student in to do key informant interviews with other junior high school students about whether an education project is working? Because they won't lie to each other. but they might lie if a teacher asks them if something is working, right? And so you send in like maybe somebody who was in the faculty to talk to faculty members. And so we figure out ways that participants can do that. There's also, again, with the advent of technology the way it is, you can crowdsource all sorts of evaluation, and people can be collecting data, and you can in real time upload that data to a database on the internet. And so it's like, again, I'm not going to go into that, but do a little research on participant evaluation. This is when I want you to look at the bottom illustration first. So a guy named Paul Barron, or Baran, he invented packet switching, technological genius. It's kind of what makes the internet able to work. In the 60s, the Pentagon said, what kind of communications network would be least vulnerable to attack? And so they looked at these kind of networks. And so centralized on the far left is the most vulnerable to attack because you have a single point of failure in the middle. And if you're organizing people and trying to get information out to people, if something happens to that center node, you're not getting information out to people. Decentralized, a little bit better, but you still have single points of failure. If you have a network, and what you're trying to do in the ABCDI Institute is create this network of people, you can have people who are sharing information all the time, who, if one of those nodes disappears, there's multiple opportunities for somebody else to pick up the slack and for other people to join. So you're not, so what I would suggest is the work that you're doing, try to get more networked activity into it and get it away from centralized activity. And on the table in the top, networks, they require things that you want. They require the openness and interaction. They require diversity. You only get diversities of opinion on how to solve a problem in a community if you have an open network and people can share that information. This is the last thing I'm going to show you. Again, I'm back to this concept of that we live in a world that is just divided. This is a really basic community organizing concept that people need to be reminded about frequently, that change happens in the center. So this is the world as is shown to you right now. You think that this is like, this woman is, let's say this woman is you, us, and this guy yelling at her is them. It's not, the world is not just like that. There are people who are literally neutral. And sometimes they just haven't made up their mind. They're on the fence. Sometimes they're ambivalent and they just don't care. But there are people who are neutral. There are also people who are passively on the anti side and people who are passively on your side. You will never change, the pro person will never change the anti person's mind. The anti person will never change the pro person's mind. You don't even need to talk to them or care about them. The strategy is to move the passively people, get a handful of them over to be fully on board with you. Have the passively pro people maybe work with the neutral people to get them to move over one spot. And you wouldn't think this is possible, but it is possible. And I'll give you an example in a second. To get some of the passively anti people to actually maybe at least be neutral, may actually be passively pro. An example of how this has happened is with the issue of gay marriage. So, you know, if it was like 20 years ago and you said, well, someday it'll be legal for gay people to marry in this country, and people would have said you were nuts. But what has happened was there are people who were maybe in the passively anti box, right? And somebody in their life, a gay person, was brave enough to come out to them. And at that point, then this passively anti person said, oh, you know, Joe is like, he's a good guy. It's like he's not this terrible blah 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 whatever that he's been led to believe that gay people are. And so as those people a little bit of time change their mind, then that's how change happens at the center. And this happens at the center in a lot of issues, most issues. And so I am going to quit there. Who has questions?
Thank you, John. That's a lot of good food for thought. We would love to open it up for questions that folks have. Thank you, John, for going through the high points of the book. So with that, I will open it up to questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes or so for just open dialogue. So who would like to start us off with a question about the points that John raised or the book overall? If
If
not,
you don't want to ask a
I
question
am
in front of all
prepared for
these
one.
people, okay.
I am prepared for
Otherwise,
one.
you can email me directly if you have a question you don't want to ask in front of a bunch of people.
Absolutely. So Jen is monitoring the chat. You're welcome. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat. Jen, please share with us anything that comes through. And I wonder, John, one of the things in the book. So I'll start us off. One of the things that you comment on in the book, it's page 88, and it's one of the most appealing aspects of asset-based community development as a straight change strategy, is that people's contributions to the overall effort are not ranked or graded. ABCD is not a competitive effort. If asset is narrowly defined to refer only to financial assets, then assets are a scarce resource and the solutions to the challenge we face beyond commodity. So I wonder if you could kind of comment on that in terms of this, that when you're working at one of the themes of the book is that when you're working in grassroots change, it's not about competition, but rather in working together and working together for a common goal. So could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time in my career being a professional meeting goer, you know, and what we know about this whole notion of associations. If you're at a table, if you're like got a group of people from your community, and the people who are sitting at that table who are basically being paid, they're there as part of their job, and they're just representing their employer at the table. That's one thing. But if there's a person who's at that table who's just there because it's tearing their heart out that this issue isn't being addressed, their input is really valuable. As is the people who so you're having meetings, and there's somebody who, when you're looking at people's assets, it's like, hey, I'm not real smart, I don't know stuff, but I'm good with kids. Well, we need people who might babysit the kids for an hour, some people who can attend a meeting. I was at a years ago at a big bank, a very large bank's corporate headquarters, and the issue that they were trying to address, and it's a bunch of old white guys who look like I look now, and they were looking at the unbanked people who go to check cashing places and get ripped off by check cashing places, and they were interested in the Latino community because there's a lot of Latino immigrants, and they were saying these guys there was I was the youngest person in the room, and then there's a woman. The only woman in the room was sitting next to me, and she was the only Latino person in the room. And these guys were tossing around ideas like, "Well, we have a curriculum. Why don't we just like get it translated into Spanish?" And this woman is just, I could tell, she was just like, "Oh, these idiots." And so after they talked about this like 40 minutes, she raises her hand and she goes, "This is what you do." She didn't say, "Well, have you thought of student?" No, this is what you do. You go to like church basements when they're, after church, and say, "There's a person here who wants to help you learn how your kids are getting ripped off." And it's like these adults were the people who are getting ripped off, but it's like if you put it in the context to them of, if you know this, it'll keep your kids from getting ripped off, then they both learn it. It's teach the teacher thing. They learn it, and then their kids will also learn it. And so it's like her contribution to that meeting was just like, I think she was invited because they wanted somebody who represented the Latino community there, but she had the solution. So I think that you're not weighing people's values, because the the most important thing that could be said during the, you never know what's coming from, and it might come from this. Is why I said, go talk to homeless people if you're working with homeless, go talk to kids if you're working in schools. But I think that's what I was trying to get to, is that it's like you never know where the really, really, you know, one more thing I did. Anyway, is there
So
any other?
on that note, are there other, thank you, John, for commenting on that. Other questions? Lisa, it looks like you're coming off mute. Would
Yeah,
you like to add a
I just
question?
wanted to make a comment and thank you, John, for a great presentation. I really like that you talked more in depth about the difference between community outreach and community engagement, because I know we use those terms instinctively, and I've heard people use them interchangeably, but I appreciated that you showed the discernment between the two, and I think uh, I'll I'll think a little bit more before I use those terms now because of the definitions you had under them. Community, but with community outreach being one side reaching out to the other, whereas engagement is always talking and always working with people. So I just found that interesting, and I just really appreciate that. So,
Thank you.
mhm.
Great. We have about 5 more minutes. We have other questions or thoughts or comments about anything John mentioned in his book. So I wonder in the time remaining, if folks would be willing to put in the chat or come off mute and say one takeaway you have from our time together today. So from something that John said or from another participant, what was one thing you're going to take away and use from our dialogue today? No, there are no wrong answers here, and certainly it's just from our participation together on this book talk. Anybody? So I'll share one, and then John, maybe if you could give us a closing comment. Okay, thank you, Allison. The grounding in associational life, absolutely. Are there others? All right, the difference between community engagement and community outreach was helpful. General thanks to you, John, and then a value what you measure and measure what you value. Those are excellent takeaways, and I think things we can always use in our day-to-day practice. And I think my takeaway was the framing evaluation. Thank you, Barbara. I think my takeaway was just the way that John you intertwined ABCD within the greater concepts of leadership and then within the practice. So thank you for that intertwining. That gives a practical handbook on grassroots change.
Well, I just want to thank anybody who showed up today and anybody who does the work that I know that you're doing. And you wouldn't be here if you weren't always trying to do it more effectively. And that just, we need people like you out there.
Terrific. Well, thank you to the Asset-Based Community Development Institute for hosting the book talk today and for your amazing work to keep the work of asset-based community development moving forward and to keep us in engaged dialogue around how we make our practice better. So thank you to all.